Today I'm going to tell you the story of a violinist who abandoned music after the horrors of battle, only to rediscover its power in a Civil War field hospital. Thomas Bennett found himself treating wounded soldiers from both sides when his forgotten violin became an unexpected source of healing. But what happened next left everyone in shock. Please subscribe to our channel and comment where you're listening. Silent Strings, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, July 1st, 1863. Thomas Bennett wiped blood from his hands with a rag already stained rust brown from previous cleanings. Around him, the converted church basement that served as a Union field hospital hummed with the sounds of suffering, moans from the wounded, the scrape of saws through bone, the murmured prayers of the dying. "Bennett, need you over here," called Dr. Hayes, kneeling beside a newly arrived soldier with a chest wound. Thomas moved quickly, his limp barely noticeable after 9 months of practice. The Minier ball that had found his calf at Antietam had ended his infantry service but qualified him perfectly for medical duty, a wounded man who could still stand and work. "Hold him down," Hayes instructed as Thomas reached the makeshift operating table. Bullets lodged near his lung. The soldier, barely more than a boy, stared up with terrified eyes as Thomas pressed firmly on his shoulders. "Easy. Close your eyes. Think of home." As Hayes dug for the bullet with a probe, the boy's screams joined the symphony of agony that had become the background music of Thomas's existence. So different from the concert halls of Boston he had once performed, his violin singing beneath his fingers, audiences applauding appreciative. That life belonged to another man now. Thomas Bennett, the violinist, had died at Antietam alongside so many others. Only Thomas Bennett, the medic, remained. The first day of battle at Gettysburg had brought casualties streaming into their makeshift. Union forces had been pushed back through the town, taking heavy losses. The field hospitals closest to the fighting were already overwhelmed. "We're running low on chloroform," Hayes remarked as they finished bandaging the boy's chest and laudanum and just about everything else. Thomas nodded grimly. "Supply wagons are delayed. Roads clogged with reinforcements heading to the front. Well, we make do with what we have." Hayes wiped sweat from his brow, leaving a smear of blood across his forehead. "Take a break, Bennett. You've been at it 16 hours straight." Thomas wanted to protest, but the throbbing in his bad leg had become impossible to ignore. He limped outside, gulping the cool night air gratefully. The summer evening would have been pleasant under other circumstances. Stars scattered across the velvet sky, fireflies blinking in the nearby meadow. From the ridge to the south came the occasional boom of artillery as nighttime skirmishing continued. Tomorrow would bring more fighting, more wounded, more dying. The cycle seemed endless. Thomas leaned against the church wall, stretching his aching leg. His fingers moved unconsciously in the air, playing an invisible instrument, a habit he hadn't been able to. Beethoven's Violin Concerto in D major, second move. He'd been preparing it for performance when Fort Sumter fell, and everything. "You're a musician," Chaplain, watching him. Curiosity's tired eye. "Was," Thomas corrected, self-consciously lowering his violinist. "Doesn't matter now." "Seems to me it might matter quite a bit," the chaplain replied, "especially here." Thomas shook his head. "Medicine for the body, prayers for the soul. That's what these men need. And beauty, comfort, a moment's peace." The chaplain gestured toward the hospital. "They need that too." Before Thomas could respond, shouts erupted from the road. A wagon was approaching, loaded with wounded. Not Union blue this time, but Confederate gray. "Prisoners," explained a sergeant supervising their arrival. "Doctor's compliments, and he says tend them as you would our own." Hayes appeared beside Thomas, frowning at this new complication. "Rebel wounded. Just what we needed." "Orders, sir?" Thomas asked. Hayes sighed. "Same as always. Worst cases first, regardless of uniform." He studied the arriving wounded with a practiced eye. "Let's get to work." Among the Confederate wounded was an officer, his arm mangled by cannon fire, his face gray with blood loss. As Thomas helped transfer him to a pallet, something clattered to the ground from beneath the man's good arm, a violin case. Thomas stared at it, feeling as if he'd been struck. The case was battered, scorched on one side, its leather handle partially burned away. Yet the officer had clung to his spite. "Please," the Confederate gasped. "Notice. Save it. Family heirloom. All that's left." Thomas hesitated, then picked up the case. "I'll keep it safe. You focus on surviving." The officer managed a ghost of a nod before unconsciousness claimed him. Later, after the new arrivals had been stabilized, Thomas found himself alone with the violin case. He shouldn't open it. Didn't want to see what was inside. The life he'd left behind was better left buried like so many other things in this war. Yet his hands moved of their own accord. Unlatching the case, the instrument inside was surprisingly intact, given the case's condition. Italian craftsmanship, perhaps 100 years old. The finish was scratched, the neck slightly warped from heat damage, but it had survived. Like its owner, was wounded, but not Thomas closed the case quickly and tucked it beneath his. That night, casualties continued arriving as the armies repositioned for the next day's battle. Thomas worked until his vision blurred, setting bones, bandaging wounds, holding basins for the vomiting, writing final letters for the dying. Near dawn, during a rare quiet moment, he found himself beside the Confederate officer. The man was awake, his eyes clear despite the pain. "My violin?" he asked weakly. "Safe," Thomas, "though I'm not sure it's playable." The officer studied him. "You know violins." Thomas hesitated. "I used to play before the war." "Professional?" "Boston Philharmonic." The officer's eyebrows rose. "Then we're colleagues of a sort. Charleston Symphony." He attempted it. "Music makes strange bedfellows." Thomas found himself returning the smile despite everything. "James Thornton, first violin, when I still had 2 good arms." Thomas Bennett, a comfortable silence between them, the kind only possible between those who... "Would you play?" "Not mine, it's damaged, but if you have an instrument..." "I don't play anymore." The words automatic after so many months. "Not since Antietam." Thornton's eyes flickered with understanding. "The war takes so much from us all." Before Thomas could respond, Dr. Hayes appeared. "Bennett, we've got artillery casualties coming in, all hands needed." As Thomas turned to go, Thornton caught his sleeve with his good hand. "The music doesn't die unless we let it," he said, "so remember that." The words followed Thomas as he hurried to meet the incoming wounded, an unwelcome echo from a life abandoned. The music doesn't die unless we let it. But Thomas had let it die, deliberately and completely. After seeing what men could do to each other at Antietam, after holding boys as they bled out calling for their mothers, after stacking bodies like cordwood, how could anything as frivolous as music still matter? Yet, as he worked through the morning, the violin case beneath his cot seemed to call to rebuke is certain, and with each man he treated, Union and Confederate alike. Thornton's words echoed loud. "The music doesn't die unless broken." July 2nd, 1863. By noon, on the second day of battle, the hospital overflowed with wounded. Men lay on blankets in the churchyard waiting for space inside. The battle had intensified, moving south toward hills called Round Top and Little Round Top. Artillery exchanges shook the ground beneath them. Thomas worked mechanically, his hands moving from task to task, while his mind remained curiously detached. He had developed this ability at Antietam, to be present without being present, to witness suffering without absorbing it. Yet Thornton's words kept intruding, disrupting his carefully maintained. "The music doesn't die." "How's our Confederate musician?" asked Dr. He paused to gulp lukewarm coffee between surgery. "Fever's set in. Arm needs to come off if he's to have any chance." Hayes rubbed his bloodshot eye. "I've scheduled him for this afternoon." Thomas glanced toward Thornton's cot. The violinist was conscious but clearly suffering, his face flushed with fever, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "I'll tell him," Thomas volunteered. Thornton received the news with grim resignation. "Will I live?" "Better odds." The arm go. Thornton's eyes drifted to the violin case propped. "No more violin then. There are other instruments. Piano, conducting, a bitters." "How optimistic." "The Confederacy isn't known for its abundance of orchestra." Thomas had no response to. The war had shuttered concert halls across the nation. North, musicians had traded instruments for rifles. "Before they take it, Thornton, I'd like to hear it played one more time." Thomas stiffened. "Told you, not by you, by someone, anyone." Thornton's good hand clutched Thomas's. "Please." Thomas looked away. "I'll try to find someone." He asked among the hospital staff, but found no one. Most had never touched a violin. Those few with musical training were too busy with the wounded. He even inquired among the ambulatory patients, without success. As the afternoon wore on, orderlies prepared the operating area for Thornton's amputation. Thomas found himself avoiding the Confederate officer, unwilling to deliver his failure. "The music doesn't die unless we let it." The words wouldn't leave. Sitting alone in a quiet corner of the churchyard, Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his silence. Music had been his life's purpose, his connection to something larger than himself, until Antietam. He remembered playing for wounded men in the early days of the war, how their faces had relaxed, how even those in agony had found momentary peace in melody. He had stopped because it hurt too much. To create beauty in a world filled with such ugliness seemed an unbearable contradiction, but perhaps that was exactly why it mattered. Thomas returned to the church and retrieved Thornton's violin case from beneath. Carrying it outside, away from the crowded hospital, he found a quiet spot beneath an oak tree. The case opened with a familiar. He lifted the instrument, feeling its weight, lighter than his own Guarneri, but well balanced. The heat damage was worse than he'd initially. The bridge was warped, the fingerboard slightly separated from the neck. Still, he tightened the bow, noting how the horsehair was frayed but serviceable. Tuning was difficult to peg, but muscle memory got his fingers. After several attempts, he had the strings reasonably tuned. Thomas hesitated, bow hovering, his hands even if his heart. He drew the bow across the open strings, wincing at the tinny sound. The violin needed proper serve for what he intended. He began with scale, simple finger exercises to reacquaint him. The instrument protested, notes wavering and occasionally screeching. After a few minutes, he attempted a simple folk tune, Shenandoah, a melody known throughout both North and South. The violin's damaged state gave the song a haunting, wounded quality that seemed fitting. Thomas closed his eyes, allowing himself to remember how it felt to speak through music. The tune flowed into another. Lorena, a ballad soldiers on both sides sang around campfires, thinking of sweethearts left behind. He didn't notice the small audience gathering until he finished the song. A few ambulatory patients and several medicals had stopped to listen, their faces showing the first peace he'd seen since the battle began. "Don't stop," called. Thomas hesitated, then nodded. He played Home Sweet Home, the melody lilting despite the violin's imperfection. More listeners gathered, drawn by the unexpected sound of music amid warfare's cacophony. When he finished, Thomas returned to the church without acknowledging the quiet thanks of his audience. He felt raw, exposed, as if he'd revealed something deeply. Yet something had shifted inside him, a door cracked open that he'd thought permanently sealed. He found Thornton being prepared for surgery, orderlies transferring him to the operating table. The Confederate officer's eyes widened of Thomas carrying the violin. "You found someone," Thornton. Thomas nodded, unable to admit that the violin needs proper repairs, but it still has music in it. Thornton smiled through his pain. "As do you, I suspect." Before Thomas could respond, Dr. Hayes called for ether. The operation couldn't wait. "Play for the others," Thornton whispered, as the anesthetic cone lowered toward his face. "They need it more than I do." Thomas retreated to the far corner of the hospital as the amputation began. The violin felt both foreign and familiar in his hands, like meeting an old friend after a bitter estrangement. Instead of returning it to its case, he raised it to his shoulder and began to play softly, Bach's air on the G string, its gentle melody barely audible above the hospital sound. Yet patients nearby turned toward the music, their faces registering surprise, then relief. He played through the afternoon as the battle raged on distant ridges. Simple tunes, folk songs, hymns, music that spoke of home and peace and things worth remembering. Between each piece, he told himself he would stop, put the violin away, return to being only a medic. Yet each time, another patient would catch his. A boy whimpering in pain, an old sergeant staring vacantly at the ceiling, a dying man clutching a blood-soaked letter, and Thomas would raise the bow again. By evening, word had spread. The wounded asked to be carried closer to where he played. Dr. Hayes, initially skeptical of this distraction, observed that patients required less laudanum while the music continued. Thomas played until his fingers cramped and his shoulder ached. When he finally stopped, the hospital seemed somehow different, still filled with suffering, yet with an undercurrent of something else, resilience perhaps, or hope. As he carefully returned the violin to its case, Thomas realized that Thornton had been right. The music hadn't died. It had been waiting for him to remember why it mattered. Rising crescendo. July 3rd, 1860. Broke over Gettysburg with an eerie stillness. After 2 days of savage fighting, both armies seemed to pause, gathering strength for what would come next. In the field hospital, Thomas checked on James Thornton, who had survived his amputation but remained unconscious, his breath shallow, skin hot with fever. "Will he live?" Thomas asked Dr. Hayes, who was making his morning round. Hayes shook his head. Hard to say. He's young, strong, but infection's the real enemy now. Thomas glanced at the violin case propped beside Thornton's cot. I played it yet. His violin, I heard. Hayes studied tired eyes. The men responded well. Less pain medication, easier to manage. It was just a few songs. It was more than that. Hayes adjusted Thornton's. These men have seen hell. They've forgotten there's anything else. Your music reminded them. Before Thomas could respond, a messenger appeared at the little entrance. Doctor, command says prepare for casualty. Major Confederate assault expected within hours. The relative quiet of the morning erupted frantic. Additional operating tables were set up, bandages prepared, instruments sterilized. Thomas worked alongside nurses and orderlies, his mind divided between the tasks at hand and the violin safely stowed beneath his. At mid-morning, the Confederate artillery opened fire. The barrage was unlike anything Thomas had experienced. Over 100 cannon firing simultaneously, shells screaming overhead, some landing perilously close to the hospital. The building shook. With each impact, dust and plaster raining down from the... They're targeting the cemetery, Hayes shouted over the din. But their aim is off. Some shells are falling short into town. The bombardment continued for nearly 2 hours. Patients cowered under blankets or cots, many praying aloud. The medical staff worked on, though each nearby explosion made them flinch. During a brief lull, Thomas found himself beside Thornton's cot again. The Confederate officer had regained consciousness, his eyes glassy with pain and fever. Some welcome for the third day, Thornton. Your artillery or ours? Yours, Thomas replied, offering water. Sounds like every cannon in Virginia. Thornton drank weakly. Preparing for an assault, probably Pickett's division. How can you know that? A ghost of a smile crossed Thornton's. Musicians hear things. Officers talk freely around us, thinking we only understand notes, not words. The bombardment resumed before Thomas could question. As it reached its height, patients began to panic, crying out, trying to flee their beds despite grievous wounds. Bennett, Hayes called from across the... Do something! Thomas understood immediately. He retrieved Thornton's violin, quickly tuning it as shells exploded outside. The damaged instrument would barely be heard over the artillery, but he had to try. He began with Battle Hymn of the Republic, its martial rhythm matching the cadence of the guns. The Union soldiers recognized it immediately, some joining in with hoarse voices. The Confederates looked less pleased, but the music itself, the presence of something controlled and intentional amid the chaos, seemed to steady them. As Thomas played, moving through a repertoire of songs from both North and South, the effect on the ward was remarkable. Men still flinched at close explosions, but the blind panic subsided. Some even managed to sleep despite the cacophony. When the barrage finally ended, an unnatural silence, Thomas continued playing, sensing the men needed the music now more than ever. They all knew what the silence meant. The artillery had done its work, and now men would advance across open ground toward entrenched position. Thousands would die. They're coming, Thornton, as Thomas paused between songs. God help them! In the distance, rifle fire erupted, first scattered shots, then the continuous roar of massed volleys. The Confederate assault on Cemetery Ridge had begun. Thomas set aside the violin, knowing casualties would soon arrive. He wasn't wrong. Within 30 minutes, the wounded began streaming in, mostly Confederate this time, men cut down during the assault that would later be known as Pickett's Charge. The injuries were catastrophic. Men torn apart by canisters, limbs shattered by rifle fire, faces obliterated beyond recognition. Thomas worked alongside Hayes until his arms ached, moving from patient to doing what little could be done for many. It's a slaughter, Hayes muttered as they amputated a young Confederate's leg. These men never had a chance. Thomas said nothing, focused on his grim work. Yet, as the afternoon wore on, he found himself glancing repeatedly at the violin. These broken men streaming in were the lucky ones. They had survived to reach medical care. Thousands more lay dead or dying on the field between the armies. During a brief respite, the flow of wounded temporarily ebbed. Thomas picked up the violin again. This time, he played a simple lullaby, the kind sung to children across the North. Its gentle melody felt like a benediction, the dying, a comfort for those who would never... Play Dixie, requested a captain's face gray with his orderlies. If I'm to die in Pennsylvania, at least let me hear it once more. Thomas hesitated, aware of the Union wounded listening. Then he nodded and began the familiar tune, the unofficial anthem of the South. The Confederate soldiers stirred, some smiling through their pain. Surprisingly, the Union men didn't object. Perhaps in this place of shared suffering, the divisive power of such songs was diminished. When he finished Dixie, Thomas immediately transitioned to the battle cry of freedom, its lyrics rallying Northern hearts just as Dixie did Southern ones. Back and forth he went, playing the songs of both sides, weaving them together until they seemed parts of a single, complex melody, the music of a nation at war with itself. As evening approached, news filtered in from the front lines. The Confederate assault had failed. Lee's army was in retreat. The Battle of Gettysburg was effectively over, though skirmishing would continue for days. Thomas played until darkness fell, until lamps were lit, and the moans of the wounded became the primary sound. Only then did he set aside the violin, his fingers cramped, his shoulder aching, yet feeling more alive than he had since Antietam. He made his way to Thornton's cot, concerned by the Confederates' deteriorating condition. The fever had worsened, infection taking firm hold despite the doctor's best effort. "You played for them," Thornton whispered, each word an effort, both sides. "Music doesn't take sides," Thomas replied, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "No, men do that." Thornton's eyes closed briefly. "The violin, when I'm gone, keep it. You're not dying, not after surviving the amputation." Thornton managed a weak smile. "We both know better." He reached out with his remaining hand, gripping Thomas's wrist with surprising strength. "Promise me. Keep playing. They need it. You need it." Before Thomas could respond, a commotion erupted at the hospital, and Dr. Hayes rushed past, shouting orders. "What's happening?" was called to an orderly. "Confederate artillery targeting the town," came the breathless. "Direct hit on the church 2 blocks over. They're evacuating all hospitals in the area." Thomas looked back at Thornton, whose eyes had drifted closed again. The order to evacuate meant moving hundreds of wounded men, many of whom wouldn't survive the journey. In that moment, Thomas Bennett, once of the Boston Philharmonic, now a Union medic with a borrowed Confederate violin, faced a choice that would define whatever remained of his life. Final movement. July 4th, 1863. Rain fell over Gettysburg, washing blood into the soil of Pennsylvania. Independence Day, a bitter irony not lost on those tending the wounded. The evacuation order had come too late the previous night. Confederate shells had struck buildings just a block away, forcing them to shelter in place until dawn. Thomas had not slept. He'd spent the night moving between patients, checking bandages, administering what little morphine remained, and occasionally playing soft melodies for those unable to rest. Thornton had fallen into unconsciousness shortly after their last conversation, his fever raging unchecked. "We move the ambulatory patients first," Dr. Hayes announced, as gray light filtered through the windows. "Then those with the best chance of surviving transport. Wagons are limited, armies prioritizing ammunition and supplies for pursuing Lee's retreat." "Critical?" Thomas asked, though he already. Hayes met his gaze steadily. "Volunteers will remain behind with—" "I'll stay, of course." "I'll stay," Hayes unsurprised. "I thought you might. Choose 10 patients you think can last until relief arrives. The rest—" He didn't finish the sentence. The impossible task of selecting who might live fell to Thomas. He moved through the ward, assessing each man, Union and Confederate alike, with clinical detachment. Those with the strongest pulses, the least severe infections, the most stable wounds were marked with strips of white cloth. The others received nothing but a wordless touch on the shoulder, a silent acknowledgment of their coming fate. Thornton was not among the 10. His pulse fluttered weakly, his breathing shallow, irregular. The infection had spread from his amputations, his skin mottled with telltale streaks of blood poisoning. As the evacuation began, the hospital grew steadily emptier. Wagon after wagon departed, carrying the fortunate ones toward better facilities in York and Harrisburg. By noon, only Thomas, Hayes, an elderly chaplain, and 27 critical patients remained, 17 more than they had sustained. "Play for them," Hayes said quietly, handing Thomas the violin case. "It's all we can offer." Thomas positioned himself in the center of the room, where all could hear. The rain drummed steadily on the roof as he raised the bow and began with amazing grace, its promise of salvation speaking to believers on both sides. He played without pause for over an hour, hymns, folk songs, patriotic airs. Some patients hummed weakly along, others simply listened, their pain-filled eyes fixed on him as if the music were a lifeline they clung. 3 men died during his performance, slipping away so quietly that Thomas noticed only when Hayes gently covered their faces with blanket. He faltered briefly, then continued playing, understanding now that his music served not just as comfort for the living, but as a benediction for the dying. When he finally lowered the bow, his arms trembling with fatigue, Hayes approached with a cup of water. "The colonel's asking for you," he said, nodding toward Thornton. "He's lucid, but it won't last." Thomas found Thornton awake but barely present, his eyes glassy with fever yet somehow focused. "You stayed, Confederate?" "Yes, to play for them." Thomas nodded. "For all of them." A ghost of a smile touched Thornton's cracked. "You found your purpose again." "I'm still a medic, not a musician." "You're both. The healing comes through the music now." Thornton's remaining hand reached for Thomas. "I need to tell you something." Thomas leaned closer, straining to hear the fading voice. "Ralston, my family home on Meeting Street, a Stradivarius in the music room, hidden beneath the floorboards when the war came." His grip tightened to prizing strength. "Find it, after the war. It shouldn't be lost." "The Confederacy isn't defeated yet," Thomas reminded him gently. Thornton's laugh was barely "It is. We just don't know it." His eyes drifted past Thomas to some distant point. "Promise me." "The violin." "Find it." "I promised," though he wondered if he would survive the war himself, let alone make it to Charleston. Thornton seemed satisfied. His eyes closed. His breathing steadied somewhat. "Play Bach," he murmured. "The Chaconne." "You know it?" "Yes." It was among the most challenging solo violin pieces ever written, a monument of the repertoire that Thomas had performed only twice publicly. For the journey, then, Thomas retrieved the damaged violin, knowing it was inadequate for such a piece, yet understanding what Thornton was asking. As he positioned the instrument under his chin, he saw that Hayes and the chaplain had gathered the remaining patients, arranging them in a rough semicircle. Everyone who could turn their head had done so, faces expectant. The first notes of Bach's Chaconne in D minor filled the rain-soaked silence. Despite the violin's limitations, the music transcended its vessel, the mathematical precision of Bach's genius, creating order from chaos. Thomas closed his eyes, surrendering to the familiar patterns his fingers had memorized years ago. He was barely a quarter through the piece when he realized Thornton had stopped breathing. The Confederate officer's face had relaxed in death, the pain and fever finally releasing their hold. Yet Thomas continued playing, understanding that the music now was not for Thornton alone, but for all of them, the living and the dead, blue and gray, divided by war, yet united in their humanity. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming counterpoint to Bach's masterwork. Thomas played on, each note an affirmation that beauty could exist alongside suffering, that meaning could be found even in war's senseless waste. When the final chord faded, profound silence settled over the room, broken only by the steady rainfall. Thomas lowered the violin slowly, aware that something fundamental had shifted within him. He was not the same man who had abandoned music after Antietam, nor was he merely the medic who had treated the wounded at Gettysburg. He was both, and perhaps something more, a healer whose medicine now included both bandages and Bach. Hayes approached, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Relief wagons are coming. I can hear them." Thomas nodded, carefully returning the violin to its case. Thornton's final gift to him, along with a purpose renewed. In the months and years that followed, Thomas Bennett would become known throughout the Union Army as the playing medic. From Gettysburg to the wilderness, from Cold Harbor to Appomattox, he moved among the wounded with his medical kit and his violin, offering both physical care and solace. The Stradivarius remained hidden beneath Charleston floorboards until 1866, when a former Union medic with a pronounced limp appeared on Meeting Street, bearing a letter from a Confederate officer's sister, granting him permission to recover her brother's most treasured possession. By then, Miss Bennett had learned what James Thornton had understood in his final hours, that music does not take sides in human conflict. It merely reminds us, in our darkest moments, of the beauty we are capable of creating when the cannons finally fall silent.